Welcome to the I Now Pronounce You Divorced podcast, where we have three award-winning family law attorneys dive into intriguing topics like divorce, military divorce, custody and visitation, trust and estate planning, and all things family law. Join us as we provide a comprehensive viewpoint through the eyes of our experts and guests, aiming to educate and soothe our listeners. Get ready to tune in because I Now Pronounce You Divorced starts right now.
Hi, I'm Charles Hatley. Thank you for coming back to I Now Pronounce You Divorce, where today I'm joined by Mr. Dan Cuneo, and we're going to talk about something that we see quite frequently from the people calling in looking for help, and that's a higher net worth divorce. A high net worth divorce, I say, is anything where you have assets at 250,000 and above. And I know that some people would push back and say, hey, maybe 500,000 or maybe 750,000 and above. But really, what you're getting at is the amount of money that you're trying to divide is so large that it becomes worth it for either side to swing the pendulum 1 or 2% either way. So, Dan, in your experience with high net worth divorces, what is you routinely the first question that you get asked?
Are you qualified to take my case? That's always the first one I get asked. And then the second one is, I have all this money, but I'm not sure what is the division of assets going to look like? How much can I keep for myself? And what do I need to do if I'm not ready to move forward to protect myself in the future? And so those are really kind of the most common questions that I get asked. And then, we were talking before the podcast, kind of what is high net worth? And I agree. It's, if it's even that $250,000, some may look, hear this saying, oh, well, I'm nowhere near that. But if you think about it, by the time you add in 401k, by the time you add any equity in your house, or if you have any rental properties, cars, other assets, you may far exceed that 250,000. And it is definitely worth conversation to have with an attorney to make sure that what you have, is it marital, is it premarital, how was it acquired? So, having those conversations and making sure that you know exactly what your risk is if you decide to move forward. You want to have a game plan in that. And we were on our other podcast, the Business Blueprint, just talking about what is that game plan? What is that plan going to be for your business to grow? It's really no different in these situations. What is the best game plan to make sure that you're protected, or your kids are protected, the assets are protected? So when you have these high net worth cases that come in, you want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence to know, okay, this is what I have. This is what I'm thinking maybe my exposure, but what do I do? Or clients come in and say, my spouse filed against me. I really don't want to give up more than 50%. What do I need to do? And it's sometimes difficult conversations, but it's really just kind of diving in and figure out, okay, what are the assets, and really just kind of breaking it down asset by asset.
And that, when you're talking about, a lot of assets that may cross state lines or even international lines, it's not uncommon for people to come in now and say, look, I bought one of those $1 houses over in Italy that's now worth, $2 million, because even though it's a dollar, you have to do a lot of repairs on it before you actually get to keep it. But, when you're going through these assets, I kind of loved your first question. Are you qualified to do this? Because a lot of people look at divorce and they say, look, one divorce attorney is as good as another divorce lawyer, as good as another divorce lawyer, is as good as the one online that I can fill out myself. And when you're sitting down and you're trying to value these assets, you need somebody that's going to methodically go through each and every asset and ask you these questions, not only, hey, what assets do you have, but when did you acquire them? What money did you use to acquire them, right? It becomes extraordinarily important to back up. Well, did you have money before you came into the marriage? Like you were talking about with premarital assets, what if somebody had $100,000 coming in the marriage that they actually put the down payment on the house now? And I know in our Northern Virginia office, we see houses that over the past 20 years have quadrupled in value. They've gone from $250,000 up to, almost 2 million.
Right.
And, the $100,000 down payment on that house would eat up a tremendous portion of the equity. I was reading, and premarital assets are so important. I was reading a story, an article the other day. It's about the largest private home in America is going through a divorce right now. People that own it are going through a divorce. I think it's an heir to the Hyatt or hotel. But the husband moved out, went and bought a penthouse. The wife stayed in the home. She gets a letter from a trust organization, the trust, and says, hey, you're not able to live in this house anymore. You're not actually a beneficiary of the trust. Please get out. Lo and behold, nobody in the marriage owned this home. This $200 million house that she had been living in, it turned out the trust owned it. The trust was premarital, and now that throws a monkey wrench in everything. So when you're dealing with clients, especially in high earning, in a lot of our high asset divorces, one spouse has the majority of the assets and the other spouse doesn't.
Mhm.
How do you sit down with sometimes the spouse that doesn't and say, hey, we got to try to dig and find this stuff, and it's not going to be easy?
Right. Those can be difficult because they're going through an emotional time in their lives, and maybe they're not thinking clearly, or they just want to get out because they're hurt or anger, whatever the case may be. But I feel as practitioners, it's our job to make sure that we're doing the due diligence, which is mapping out everything that they have. And it's being methodical, and it's going kind of a
Mhm.
timeline, as you were talking about earlier. All right, tell me, what was it like before the marriage, in the sense of what were the assets? Did either of you have anything before the marriage? And then when you were married, did you commingle any of those assets? Were any of those assets sold? And if they were sold, let's kind of start walking through and tracing, essentially, where those funds went. Were they used to acquire another asset? And then what is that asset worth? And who lives in that particular asset, or who owns that asset? And then ask them, kind of your example in the trust, do you have any estate planning documents? What does the estate planning look like? Because in that situation you described, that's tough, because that person may not have known that they weren't a beneficiary, and they're thinking, oh, okay, I have access to this home because I'm the spouse. And usually there's some form of, you have the ability to stay in there. But if there's a trust that owns it, then it's okay, the trust is going to control it. And then you're in another difficult situation, where I would call more complex, because if you're asked to leave, or you're being evicted, you may not have a place to go. So now you need to get monetary assistance or help from the other side. And whether it's from the trust or from the spouse, you need a place to live. And a lot of course, at least realm licenses, that are going to look at what is the standard of the living. And so I think in that situation you described, the standard of living is going to be pretty high. And so maybe the other side may agree to allow that person to stay in the house pending resolution of the case. But it's really just mapping out asset by asset. And then once I've compiled a list of what the assets are, what my client thinks that they're worth, then it's going back and kind of walking through, okay, how do we get to that valuation? Where are other assets put in there? And then I need to assess what the assets are and determine, do I need to get any experts involved? Because there's just a whole host of experts that you may have to get involved. If there's companies, or if there's other tangible assets that are maybe unique, that you have to get some very niche expert involved to do an evaluation. And so we have to just kind of walk through that, what that looks like. But it's always good just to have that full disclosure of what you think the assets are. And then of course you have to look at what the debt is too. But I always like to start with the assets, because it's kind of be our guide as far as what is my client's interest, and then what are his or her goals.
And bringing in experts, you got to bring them in early, right? And you're talking about these niche experts. And while you're talking, I was reminded of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Like, their divorce has been going on forever. And, they were trying to value some wine chateau over in France. And I'm probably wrong about the country. I just know they were trying to value some piece of property that was so unique, it was impossible to value. And sometimes, even in what I would call your lower tier high net worth divorces, you'll have pieces of jewelry that were passed down from parents. You'll have maybe, I had a client who had an artwork collection, and he had this beautiful artwork collection from his grandfather, who was a famous painter. And these pieces were worth millions, and the other side threw up their hands. They have to be valued, they have to be valued. They slowed everything down. Well, it turned out, and nobody would listen when I said this, that the grandfather, who was a famous painter, his company that he owned licensed the paintings to them. They didn't give them to them. So all of this effort to realize that famous rich grandfather was also smart. um so how do you handle it? And I always felt bad for the other side in that case, because man, their entire theory of what they were going to be dividing really hinged on this artwork. How do you handle in a high net worth case? We're talking about trust and licensing, when all of a sudden some huge asset that you've been banking on for, or well, not you, your client's been banking on, is the rug's pulled out from under you, so to say.
Right. Those are always tough conversations, but it starts in the beginning. I always go back to doing your due diligence, and in most jurisdictions, it's going to start with discovery, and it's discovery is a fact finding to where, okay, I need to ask these questions because I just have to figure out what exactly there is. But it starts with, here's what my client is saying. Here's what I think that there is. Here's the questions I'm going to ask them. Based on the information I get back, I'm going to read, do an analysis and assessment of, okay, what is my next step? Usually it's, do I need to get an expert involved? Because if you have paintings, as you were saying earlier, I know nothing about paintings. I can't even draw a stick figure correctly. So I definitely need to get someone involved that can help me. I rely heavily, when I was litigating a lot, experts were probably the best investment my clients could make, because they're coming to me for the law and to represent them. But I'm going to need someone to help me as far as what assets are involved and the questions to ask, so I can not only zealously advocate for my client, but to be able to put on the best case and to know what are my risks and what are the pitfalls and what do I need to do. And getting someone involved early, as you mentioned, is so pivotal, because it allows you to be able to really move that case forward in the way that best protects the client. And if I have this information in front of me, I now have someone in that field that can say, okay, well, you have these paintings, and based upon my experience, this is what they're worth. But in order to determine that, we really need to track, where did they come from? And then hopefully through that, you'll be able to find out that maybe there is no ownership to these paintings or any type of inheritance. That's just more of their license to them. So they just are able to have them and put them up and be able to benefit just from the beauty of the painting, I guess. But there's really no financial ownership to that. So that's tough, because you think that you have this asset or this painting that may be worth hundreds of thousands or more, and you're using that in determining, okay, this is what the marital estate is worth, and this is how we're going to divide it. When if you don't know that ahead of time and you go into court, your whole cases could be potentially just blown out of the water. And then now you're left to quickly scramble, and that's not good for anybody. And then you're giving the advantage to the other side, because they may have known that this asset, there's no ownership to it by way of its being licensed, or maybe there was a pre or post separation agreement signed. And so we just want to make sure that we're looking underneath every stone to do what we need to do, which is, okay, here's an asset, this is the value, and this is what we think it's worth. But getting those experts involved often and early not only helps you throughout the case, but when there you have such niche uh, assets that are in the case, there's usually not that many experts that are qualified that would be able to help you out. And so you want to make sure that you can not only get one that has the experience, but that's well known and that can speak articulately about it, and really aid you in either putting up your defense or aid you as far as why you think that this asset is worth X dollars and why your client should be entitled to a certain percentage of it.
Yeah, and I remember that case vividly because we included the licensing agreement in the discovery. We turned it over, and I guess the other side didn't read it, and so we actually had to have um, the grandfather's paintings. He was so well renowned; he had a business around it, so we had to have that attorney come up and present the licensing agreement that he drafted, and the house was worth multi millions of dollars and was completely paid off, but it paled in comparison to the value of the paintings that were hanging on the walls. And my client walked out happy. The other side walked out very, very unhappy because they felt that my client had successfully hidden assets, which wasn't true or may have been true. Right? Sometimes paperwork can be created to hide assets, and unbeknownst to the attorney. So, another question that I've gotten before, I had somebody call and I refused to represent them. They said, "Hey, look, I'm up into like the uh, 10, 9, 11 figure range, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars net worth, 10 figures." And they were like, "I don't want to give my wife a dime. Can you help me stall the divorce process so I can set up this offshore trust?" I was like, "No, I can't." So, in high net worth divorces, I know you've probably gotten a similar question. How far can we go in aiding our clients in preserving their estate and never cross that line into hiding assets?
Right, right. I get asked that all the time, especially when I was litigating a lot. Is, I don't want to give my spouse anything. What can I do to hide assets or prevent them from getting a X percentage? And we can't ever hide assets. That's always tough. And I like to think that clients are coming in not wanting to do something nefarious or to deceive the court or anything illegal. Just in their mind, it's just more of, I don't want them to have anything. What can I do? But there are times when they come in and say, I don't care if it's against the law. I'm not going to give that spouse anything because of X, Y, and Z. And unfortunately, then we just can't represent them because we're not going to aid them to do anything that would be illegal or unethical. But there are ways that we can try to mitigate that. And those are the conversations that I really try to have. And it involves with one, are there any premarital agreements? Do you have it before the marriage or after the marriage, right? Because that's going to kind of guide what we can and cannot do. But if there is nothing, then it's really, well, let's look at what your assets are. Because if you have an inheritance, maybe make sure that your wife isn't a beneficiary on it. Or if you have any insurance policies and 401ks and things like that, make sure that your beneficiaries are in line, because you can't eliminate what her interest would be from a marital standpoint. But once you pass, then you want to make sure that whoever is next, if it's your kids or if it's a new spouse, that they get access to, and it's not your current spouse. But it's also just having those hard conversations to where if you really think that this marriage is not working out, when is the most opportune time to do it, to file? And it's looking at the assets and saying, okay, we see the trend here. Like, I mean, you brought up an example earlier that, if you pay X for a property, but it could be worth Y down the road, maybe now is the time to come in before you have all this equity that you're accruing, and you have to share that with your spouse. Or if you think that in the next couple of years you're going to get a big raise or going to get promoted, maybe now is the time to separate or file for divorce. So come when you have that promotion or that new job, that income isn't taken into consideration if there's any potential issue for spousal support. Or a lot of clients come in that earn those 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 figure incomes. What can I do so I don't have to pay my spouse anything? Well, besides having those, post-marital agreements in place or premarital agreements in place, it's having those conversations. Okay, well, can he or she work? Let's get them involved in the workforce. Let's have those conversations so we can at least establish to the court that you weren't in agreement with your spouse not working, that you were always trying to encourage them, but they just for whatever reason didn't want to work and wanted to use you more as the gravy train and not really be part of the marriage. And then there's those conversations of, depending upon your jurisdiction, do you have to be physically separated for a certain period? And depending upon the jurisdiction, the separation is part of the marriage, and depending upon the jurisdiction, the separation is not included. And so there's a lot of different things that we need to discuss to determine what makes the best sense. But at the end of the day, there's not much that we can do to avoid the other side or spouse getting an interest, but there's a lot of things that we can do to mitigate that, which would be one, those marital agreements that we were talking about, but then also just making sure what the value of your assets are. And we want to make sure that we're advising them not to do anything that would be illegal. For example, if you have going back to the painting example, if you have ownership in it and it's worth $1 million, but you sell it to your buddy for $1, that might be a little suspect, and then they would in turn give it back to you. So we want to make sure that they're not doing things that they may think, oh, well, I'm just going to give it to my friend, or I'm going to sell to a relative and my wife's going to be okay with it, or my husband's going to be okay with it because she or he knows them. Well, we want to make sure that everything's above board, because during the marriage, they may not really know what's going on, but I can confidently say once that petition has been filed, you're on opposite sides. During the marriage, you're going down the same aisle together. You're standing side by side, but in a divorce proceeding, you're on opposite sides. And so what was okay or acceptable during the marriage all of a sudden becomes unacceptable. And I had no idea what was going on once something gets filed. So just kind of walking them through what the pitfalls are to make sure that if and when that would happen, the court isn't penalizing them and doing an unequitable distribution of the property because they're trying to deceive not only the court, but their spouse at the same time.
That's not only happening in high net worth divorces. We've done divorces across the spectrum. I've seen people that, are arguing over nothing but debt and are trying to shovel more debt onto the other side. And people with, normal size estates coming in and saying, look, I don't want to pay my spouse anything. How do I hide everything? But it is a question that we get a lot of, like, hey, they didn't pay anything on the mortgage throughout the whole marriage. I want to keep the entirety of the house. Well, I got some bad news for you. But like you said, we may be able to work out some sort of agreement that works for both parties. So Dan, I want to thank you for taking time to join me for part 1 of our conversation on high net worth divorces. Join us next week, and we're going to jump into some of the issues that we've seen representing professional athletes and some of the issues that we see with prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. Thank you, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you for joining us this week on I Now Pronounce You Divorced. Please join us next week for part 2.